got to arrange my equipment first of all. So first the mic, then the watch, which I'll ignore, no doubt, as the night goes on. Well, thanks for having me back once again, for laying on such special weather for my journey through from Edinburgh. Maybe that has its own lessons for us, but I'm safely here and glad to share this fellowship with you once again. And I do find it, I must say, so encouraging to see so many people turn up for what simple Bible teaching on such an evening, and with the drawback of this accent and so on, that nevertheless you prepare to face all these disadvantages and to turn up. We're hoping to spend this particular session looking at Genesis, and I want tonight to look at Genesis 1. And I've entitled this evening study, In the Beginning, God. It's been said that this is the greatest opening of any book in human literature, and that's something that I would very much want to share, these marvelous opening words, Bereshith bara Elohim. And they set the stage for all that follows in the subsequent Bible story. Now, I want to pause just for a moment on the threshold of this chapter to make one or two general points. John Calvin once said that true knowledge consists of two things: the knowledge of God and the knowledge of ourselves. And Genesis 1 introduces both of those topics. It brings before us God, and it brings before us man. And the two main players in the Bible story, therefore, are introduced to us here in their basic relationship: God as the creator and man as the creature. And the definition of that relationship is going to be established here once and for all. The parameters are here laid down. God, who is there in the beginning, and man, who is there, I mean by man the human race, there because God in sovereign love creates it. I want to point out as well that this opening chapter of Genesis is quite different from the rest of the book that follows. That is, it is different as a species of literature. The rest of the book is prefaced by the phrase you'll find in verse 4 of chapter 2. And that phrase, that statement recurs. This is the account of the heavens and the earth. It's in the Hebrew it says, these are the generations of. And all the subsequent blocks in Genesis are prefaced by that announcement. The generations of Adam, the generations of Noah, the generations of Abraham, of Jacob, Joseph, and so on. And these are all subsumed and brought together under the recurring heading that we find here in verse 4 of chapter 2. But Genesis 1 stands apart from that sequence as a block, a kind of porch in its own right, constructed on different lines, and in a way standing before and standing apart from the ensuing almost earthly history, as a kind of vestibule to the whole narrative. And the proportions of that vestibule are astonishing, because there is crammed into this opening chapter the story of the origination of the whole universe, the heavens and the earth. And that's all crammed into some 26 verses. And then the rest of the book and the rest of the Bible is concerned with the story of this puny race, the race of human beings. And those are the Bible's proportions. There is a little time devoted to the universe, a little to the story of creation, and then the rest to the story of man and the story of the redemption of man. And so this chapter, as I say, it stands apart in its own literary structure from the rest of the book of Genesis. I want to say too that although this is an extremely ancient piece of literature, it is also extremely intricate. And its artistry is quite astonishing. Now, I am not all that deeply versed in literature, although at one point it was my calling to look particularly at English and French literature. And I can say that of all I've ever read, there is no single unit that I know anywhere that has the intricacy and the attention to rhetorical detail that we find here. So, although extremely ancient, it is by no means primitive. For example, you'll find that it has a deliberate introduction, as we saw in the beginning, God created. And then the unit ends, you see, in verse 3 of chapter 2. God rested from all the work of creating. So there is what rhetoricians call an inclusio, so that the whole story is boundaried by those two statements. In the beginning, God created, and then at the end, God rested from creating. And in between that, there is a great series of rhetorical devices that make a tremendous impression, not only of the orderliness of the chapter itself, which is so magnificently structured, but the orderliness of the whole universe, God as a God of order. We have the 6 days, for example. We have the 8 great creative acts, and we have a great series of recurring phrases. And, for example, and God said, and it was so, and God looked, and it was good, and God blessed. Time and time again, that form of words recurs, as well as the form of words, and it was evening, and it was morning. And so by the recurrence of these phrases, we have at one level the attestation of the writer as a literary genius, but more important, the attestation of God himself as a God of order. Just as he creates everything in sequence and according to its kind, so he gives us here in his own word this great speech act, so brilliantly constructed. In some ways it's poetry. The artistry is so magnificent, and that artistry itself is part of the impression, perhaps the unconscious impression, that the chapter as a whole makes upon each one of us. So here it is, standing apart from the rest of the book, and attested to us by this magnificent rhetorical artistry that the whole chapter displays. Well, I think I'd better maybe approach the text itself and see what lessons it affords to us where we stand at our own point in history. So let's look first of all at this great opening statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, there is no indication given to us as to when this beginning was, but the important point is the reminder to us of what was in the beginning. In the beginning, God. Not in the beginning, man. Not in the beginning, matter. Not in the beginning, mass, or in the beginning, energy. And not in the beginning, nothing. But in the beginning, God. And you can relate that perhaps to John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was already in being. So that's what was there to begin with. And it is a question of enormous importance. Before the world, what was there? Was there anything before the world? That explains the world. Was there nothing? Or was there some lump of matter? No, Genesis says, in the beginning there was God. And it is the fact that He was that makes possible the being of everything else and of everybody else. So, in the beginning there was God. And we know from John 1:1 again, that this God who was in the beginning was not some kind of solitary, lonely creature or lonely being, but there was God, and with God there was the Word of God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And we know too from this verse itself, from verse 2 in fact, that there was also the Spirit of God, and He was hovering over the waters. And I think it's important to remind ourselves at once that in the beginning there was not simply some kind of abstract first principle or some kind of abstract deity, but in the beginning there was God and the Word of God and the Spirit of God. There was the living triune God. And this God is brought before us here with a kind of warmth, the Hebrew word Elohim. It's speaking to us of a God marked by two things. He does things and He says things. And therefore there's a vibrancy about Him. There is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and they're doers, they're agents, and they're speakers. They do and they say, they act and they speak. And this God is there in the beginning. And Genesis doesn't waste time proving that God exists. It takes it for granted as something that we know in the very depths of our hearts. As John Calvin again said, that in every human heart there is the sense of deity, there is the awareness of God. So let's not waste time, Luke says by implication, proving that He is there. In the beginning there was God. And in the beginning this God created the heavens and the earth. Now this word created, it occurs very, very seldom in the Bible, and even in Genesis 1 it occurs only 3 times. We've seen this before, I guess, here last century when we began this series. We saw that this word bara is a very special word. It is used only with God as its subject. Only God does this. Not only does the Bible never say that man creates in this sense, but it never says that any heathen deity even pretended to do this. It's never used with any other God, but only with Elohim, with the God of Israel. He created. Now, the word does not mean by itself that God creates out of nothing, because we'll see, for example, that we know that God created man, the human race, but God did not create man out of nothing. And so, bara can be used even when God does not create out of nothing. And this God is said, this Elohim who does and who speaks, He created the heavens and the earth, the whole universe, the totality of what exists, the earth and the whole of our cosmic environment. God created it all. Now, you know, the nations around Israel, they believed for the most part that each land had its own god. There was the god of Egypt, the gods of Babylon, the gods of the gods of Israel. But here we are told that the whole earth was one God, one maker. And not only the whole earth, but the whole universe was with the one maker. Not only is there one God for all the nations, but there is one God for the whole universe. And part of the glory of where we stand tonight is this, that whatever concept the ancients had, or Moses had as he wrote or edited these words, as to how vast the universe was, he had not the remotest conception in reality compared to what we know tonight as to how huge our universe is. I'm told that the entire universe is expanding at a rate of something like 10,000 miles a minute. It's expanding at that rate. And God created the totality. This one God. The heathens thought you had to have so many gods. A God for thunder, a God for water, a God for the sun, for the moon, a God for the mountains, for the rivers, a God for the harvest, a God for war, because one being couldn't possibly do all these things. And part of the splendor of this chapter is that it's saying to us that our one God did it all. The earth, the heavens, He made it all. And then, you know, again, come back to this fact of proportion. When you turn to Genesis 1:2, the heavens are already being forgotten, as if that's enough of the universe. And now let's focus on the earth. And we're told, now the earth was formless and empty. Because not that the earth is the center of the universe, but it's the earth God is interested in. Because that's the habitation of His very special creature, man. And so we're given this great summary statement. In the beginning, Elohim created the whole universe, the heavens and the earth. And now we'll turn to the earth. And this earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Now, it's a moot point whether the heavens were in the same state, or the entire universe. But we're told here that certainly the earth was in this condition. The earth was formless, the earth was empty, and there was darkness over the face of the deep. Now, in other words, there were three negative factors affecting the earth. There was darkness, the absence of light. There was emptiness, that is the absence of life. And there was formlessness, that is the absence of separation or division between the waters above and the waters below. And I think that the story which unfolds in verse 3 is a story of the way that Elohim overcame these three negatives: the darkness, the formlessness, and the emptiness. And so let's look at it as that sequence unfolds. First of all, God deals with the darkness by creating light. This is the work of day one. And significantly, it seems to have occupied the whole of day one. It's the only thing that we're told with regard to day one, the creation of light. Now we know, even better than Moses, that light is the presupposition of everything. Without light there is no order, there is no life. The speed of light, Einstein told us, is the one great constant in the universe, the one thing not subject to relativity. This is something constant. And God said, "Let there be light." How did He do it? He said, fiat lux. Hence the idea of fiat creation. He said, and there was. There was no great titanic struggle, as in the ancient mythology, between the light and the darkness. But there was this Elohim, the speaking God, and this tremendous power of the word of Elohim. And he said, let there be light. The most magnificent and the most inexplicable factor in our entire universe. What is light? God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning the first day. Just a little one brief comment on this language here. There was evening and there was morning. I think there's in fact simply the fact that to the Hebrews the day began at dusk, around 6 o'clock in the evening. And it ran from dusk to the following nightfall, not with us from the morning onwards. It ran with them from the dusk, the onset of the darkness onwards. And so this is where it all begins. God said, let there be light, the power of the creative word. And then we move on to day 2, the second day. And again, God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. Now again, there were great ancient mythologies that spoke of the desperate struggles of the gods to separate the waters above from the waters below. And again, these were titanic struggles to separate the clouds from the earth, the moisture above from the moisture below. But here you see, again, all it is, God said, let there be an expanse between, a firmament between the two. And the separation of the waters above from the waters below is effected simply by the almighty by the almighty word of God. By his word he created light, and by his word he separated the waters above from the waters below. He said, and it was so. And then again, these recurring phrases, and God said, let so and so happen, and it was so. And then you see here again, God says at the end of verse 9 there, and God saw that it was good. Again, a recurring phrases, again there in verse 18 and so on. God looks, I'll come back to that later on, but all the time, God keeps looking at his own work, and God keeps on saying, it's good. God saw, and it was good. And then we turn to day 3. And day 3 is interesting because on day 3 there are in fact 2 great creative acts. So that whereas we have 6 days, we have in fact 8 creative moments. Because day 6 also has 2 great creative moments, and that is its own interest why it is day 3 and day 6, but I won't go into that. So then on day 3, first of all, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear, and it was so. In other words, the separation of the land and the sea. And he wants the water under the sky all gathered into one continuous place. The joined up ocean, but as a result of that, the dry land appears. And again it's simply, and God said. That's the third time that phrase has occurred. It's there in verse 3, it's there in verse 6, there in verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered together to one place, and let dry ground appear. Now, it's possible, you see, that behind this particular process there may be what geologists examine in terms of their own great volcanic processes and the plate tectonics and continental drift and so on and so forth. But all these forces, these gigantic, incalculable forces, are set in motion by the Word of God. And God said, let all the waters which currently cover the whole surface of the earth, let them be gathered into one place, and let land appear. And so the land appears. And it was so, and God called the dry ground land, and the water he called the sea. And then the second creative moment on day 3, God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. Now, it's a remarkable thing, the amount of detail there is here. We're told in verse 1 that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And here we're told on day 3, let the land produce vegetation. And then that's broken up into definitions. Seed-bearing plants and trees that bear fruit with seed in it. As if this writer had some almost botanical interest. Because it wasn't simply let the land produce vegetation, but specific forms of vegetation. Now, it's also important, I think, to notice here that with the emergence of life, this is a key moment in the story of creation. Day 3, Act 2, the creation of life. The verb bara is not used. And we hear God say, let the land produce. This is what theologians call immediate creation. The creation of light is immediate. There is no other agency involved. But here, in the creation of vegetation, the emergence of those first life forms, God says, let the land itself produce. As if somehow it was the blessing of God on natural forces, that is, on the potentialities of the land itself, that led to the emergence of those plant forms. And quite possibly, this was a matter occupying vast ages of time. We're not told that in Genesis, whether or not that was true, Genesis doesn't say. But this is, by any standard, an epoch-making moment. The emergence of life. And yet, God does not do it by direct fiat. He does not say, let there be life, as he had said, let there be light. And it's part of the utter unexpectedness, the element of surprise in this narrative. If this were mythology, I'm sure you'd have God in very dramatic ways making daisies and buttercups and so on. But here, having said, let there be light, and let there be a separation of waters above and waters below, and of land and sea. Having said all that, God now says, let the land produce. And there is a very clear indication or suggestion that he's leaving that to the operation of secondary causes under his own blessing. Now, I'm not going to speculate as to how this happened, but some of you have seen, I'm sure, some of those wonderful films that show the impact of drought on the desert, and how after months or perhaps years of drought, there is nothing but mile after mile of arid sand. And then suddenly the rains come, and the wilderness blossoms, and out of all that sand, there comes the most amazing fluorescence of vegetation. Now, it was something like that God arranged here. He imparted life force, fecundity to the land itself. And he said, let the land produce. He blessed it. And by the blessing of God, the land produces this vegetation, and specified, as I said, in its various types. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And that phrase, according to their kinds, is again a very interesting phrase, because it reminds us again of the interest this writer has in order, according to their kinds. It's in a way as if he doesn't like things getting mixed up. God made things according to their kinds. And although I'm not at the moment at all opposed to GM plant experimentation, because I'm too uncertain about it to be opposed to it, there is something here that is suggesting to us that in creation, and here with regard to vegetation specifically, God has laid down boundaries, each according to its kind. And we know today that those kinds are determined genetically, that each kind has its own genetic code. And part of the message here is that things are the way they are because God made them that way. God made those kinds. That's why things are as they are. And perhaps an underlying suggestion, don't tamper with the way God has made those things. Now, it is one thing perhaps to engage in genetic research with a view to medical advance, but certainly there has to be a respect for the way God has made things after their kinds, and pay attention to those genetic barriers. You recall that later on in the Mosaic legislation it was laid down that you mustn't mix seeds, and you mustn't mix fibers, you mustn't plough with two animals of different species. Again, there is an underlying hint at least that God has built those boundaries into the way things are, and that we must respect those boundaries. And so there is the work of the third day. On day 3, a very, very special those two activities, especially because there are those two great moments on the third day. And again, God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. Again, you see this rhetorician reminding us of the close of this particular scene. And then we move into fourth day, a remarkable day, because on this day God creates the light bearers. Now, in the Genesis portrayal here, we have light created on day 1. And we have the light bearers created on day 4. There is a kind of oddity about that in a way, until you remember that you couldn't actually have the sun until you first had light, or a moon or a star, because these bodies are as dependent on light for their existence as is any other form of organized being. So this is a story not of the creation of light. There is no absurdity in it as far as I can see. First of all, God made the light, and then God makes those light bearers. And this whole section, the fourth day, is, I think, again, quite brilliant from its literary and its argumentative and dialectical purpose. And that is because in the ancient world, you see, almost every nation worshipped the stars, the sun, the moon, in some form or other. There was such reverence for these heavenly bodies. And Genesis 1 here from verse 14 downwards, only the fourth day, is to a very large extent about putting those heavenly bodies in their place. I don't mean physically, but theologically and morally. And instead of being portrayed as deities, they are portrayed as creatures. Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, and let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. And part of the brilliance of it is that he doesn't even mention them by their name. He simply says, let there be lights. Not the sun or the moon, but let there be lights. That's all they are. They're simply lights. They shouldn't have proper names. They're not deities. They're simply lights. That's what they are. And not only that, but they've got functions. They're not there to be waited upon and to be adored and worshipped. They're there to do things. They have their own function to perform. They're there to separate the day from the night. Why does the sun exist or the moon? What are they? Are they there to be worshipped? No, I said they're there to separate the day from the night. That's what they're for. And let them serve as signs to mark seasons. To tell you, what's the sun for? To be worshipped? No, but to tell you whether it's autumn or spring, summer or winter. That's what it's for. To tell you what time of the year it is. To separate the days and to separate the years. Now, it's being said here, of course, that God wants time divided into orderly units. This is all about order again. There is day and there is night, and don't turn night into day. And that again is some psychological consequence when we know the problems of day-night reversal, for example. Well, God said, let there be day, let there be night, and let there be seasons, let there be days, and let there be years. So, and let these lights, let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. It's absolutely brilliant. What's the sun for? To light up the earth. Now, the sun is far bigger. It is a colossal, exploding hydrogen bomb, literally. But what's it for, this vast thing? Well, it's to light up the earth. That's what it's for. No need to worship it. It's there to give light on the earth. And it was so. God said, let there be lights. And it was so. Again, the recurring phraseology. God made two great lights. And you would think, well, here he'll mention the sun and the moon. But no, he doesn't. He says, there's the bigger one and there's the weird one. The greater light to govern the day, and the lesser, littler light to govern the night. And what about the stars? Those stars which are so vast, those stars so far, far away, so that when your telescopes probe them, they're going back millions of years into astrophysical history. What about them, these gigantic things? Oh, yes, God made them too. While he was at it, as I've said before, he also made the stars. And God set them. What are they for? Well, they're there to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And having said all that, the story goes on. And God saw that it was good. Just as, you see, when he had made the trees, he looked and it was good. So when he made the sun and the moon and the stars, he was equally impressed, but no more impressed. He saw that it was good. And he was happy with the way things were. And he went on, and there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. He had just made the sun and the moon and the stars, and it was evening and was morning the fourth day. And that's put them, I think, very firmly in their place. And then we come on to the work of the fifth day. Again, it begins with the phrase, "And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." This is a story of the creation of the great monsters of the deep, and at the same time the emergence of birds. Maybe sea-born reptiles, maybe the birds, but again there is a polemical dimension to this. Now, Hume, for example, thought that this was the age of the dinosaurs. That's indicated for us here in verse 20. But I want to forget that word outside, because that science is provisional. Let's not allow it to have too much input upon reading of these great verses. See again here a key moment, the creation of the first animals, land-born animals and birds. And again, God does not create them out of nothing, but let the waters teem with them. Just as he had said before, let the land produce, let the earth produce. So now it's the turn of the sea to know the blessing of the Almighty, and as a consequence, to teem with living creatures. And an emphasis too on the sheer abundance of marine life. Now, maybe again we might be saying to ourselves, well, let's not tamper with it. And let's not so overfish the water teem with living souls. That's one of the most amazing things about Genesis, that it does not reserve the word souls for human beings, or even indeed for the great land-born animals referred to in verse 24, that the land produce living creatures. Again, the same phrase, that the land produce living souls. So here we have, again, so wonderful, I think, this generic term souls that covers the great sea-born creatures, the great land-born animals, and man himself, who becomes, in Genesis 2, a living soul. So man, the human race, is not distinguished by being or by having a soul, because the great sea-born animals are also living souls, and the great quadrupeds are living souls, and man is a living soul. So we belong to the phylum, to this great category, living souls. That is the fundamental pigeonhole into which you fit the human race, along with the great sea-born animals and the great land-born animals. Man is in the pigeonhole of a living soul. And we see then the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures. Now we have the verb bara here, because it's such a tremendously important moment. And yet it is not some kind of bara creation out of nothing, but it is God's blessing causing the sea, the oceans, to teem with life. So it creates out of the potentialities, or by imparting potentialities to the oceans themselves, so that they teem with living souls. But more important, the great language of verse 21. So God created the great creatures of the sea. Those great creatures were again so often seen as deities. The great, sometimes terrifying monsters of the deep, often objects of mythological wonder and adoration. But here, they're not deities, they're creatures. God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. They're the way these species, these genetic boundaries, they're there because that's the way God made them, according to their kinds. God worked out the mathematics. God gave them their codes. God made them according to their kinds. And then this remarkable thing, God blessed them and said. We haven't met this before. It's a very interesting thing that the first thing to be blessed by God in the Bible is the great corpus of the living souls of the deep. God blessed them. And God said in Genesis 1, there are three things blessed. There are those sea creatures, there is a human race, and there is a Sabbath. And they're all blessed. And here is the first occurrence of the word, God blessed them. It may be that there is a play here on the words, because the words created and the words blessed are very similar, bara and barach. And here God blesses what God created. And God said to those creatures, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. So God blesses them. And God ordains that there be fecundity and fullness, that the water should simply teem with life by the blessing of God. And it is worth reminding yourselves, that as far as I know, the word success doesn't occur anywhere in the Bible. Instead, there is the divine blessing. In my own lifetime, when ministers meet, we ask, are you having much success? Or you had much success? And it's a curious thing, the way that the form of words has altered from the past, where we speak of, are you having much blessing? But that's how it is here. God blesses them. And whatever success the species have is a consequence of that. And we see again, there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. So that's the end of the fifth day. It was marked by the creation of those great living creatures, those so-called deities, but they were made by Elohim. And then we come to day 6. And on day 6 again, there is not one, but two great creation moments. The creation, first of all, of the land-born living creatures, and then the creation of man. So let's take what's in effect 6:1. This is the seventh great creation moment. God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. Now again, I think that's so beautiful. Its creation, God said, let the land produce. It's creation, but it's mediate. It's not out of nothing, but God's saying, let the land produce living souls. And again, the emphasis, according to their kinds. Again, those genetic boundaries that distinguish kind from kind. And then the almost scientific interest in classification. Livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind. So there are three divisions there. There's the livestock, the domestic animal. There are the feral or wild animals. And in between, there are mice and rats. those things that move along the ground. And if you ask, well, why are they there? Because that's the way God made things. And they too are part of God's creation, things that run along the ground. So that's how he sees it. So God said, let the land produce these, and it was so. And God made them. It's the parallels that's so intriguing. Let the land produce, God made. God made by causing the land to produce those living creatures. And God saw that it was good. He said, and it turned out as he said, and he saw it was good. And then we come to 6:2, the eighth great creation moment, the creation of man. And suddenly, the whole narrative slows down. Everything goes into slow motion. We have crammed everything in a way into those 25 verses. The creation of the heavens, the whole field covered by astronomy, the emergence of a habitable earth, the emergence of all the great life forms of land and sea. That's all covered in 25 verses. And then it slows down, and God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and so on. And the idea of God saying, one of the things about day 6 is that phrase, God said, occurs on day 6 4 times. And I think 3 of these occurrences refer to the creation of man. So in a way, there was a lot of talking going on while God was making man. A lot of counsel, a lot of discourse. So God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and so on. So here there is a kind of pause. There is no, if we go back to verse 24, God does not say, let us make those living creatures, or let's make plants, or let's make birds. But let us make man. Deliberation. And not only so, but let us make man in our image, in our likeness. This is a contrast to the other phrase, after their kinds. God made the other life forms according to their kinds. In other words, as if God had certain templates or models of those other life forms. But here, in a way, he himself is the template or the model. Like yourselves, let us make the human race in our likeness. Image and likeness here, I think, manifestly mean the same thing. And let them rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the livestock, over all the earth. Man is to be the product of special divine deliberation. Man is made in the likeness of God, and man is given rule. Let them rule over all the creatures. That is the divine mandate. And then that's summarized in verse 27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. So that man is the divine image bearer. Man is male and female as man and woman. That, again, is the way that God made things. And then a remarkable thing occurs in verse 28. We have seen often enough in this chapter the phrase, and God said. It occurs again here in verse 28. But what is so brilliant here is this. said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Because here God was talking to someone who could understand and who could answer him back. God had said before, with regard to the living creatures, God blessed them. But God didn't say it to them. He said it about them. But here he said to them. And this is part of the glory of man. What sets him apart? So often you hear of all those similarities between man and other creatures, and we're told how similar the chimpanzee gene is to the human gene, and how similar the ape skull is to a human skull. But none of them talks. And none of them talks to God. None of them hears God. None of them is in responsive, interactive, speech act communication with God. God said to them, they're made in his image. And in God there is word. And in them, as in his image, there is word. God said to them, for the very first time, God is talking to beings outside of himself. Now, in God, of course, there was eternal discourse between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. God wasn't in need of conversation partners. He had his Son and his Spirit. But he said to them, I think this is such a brilliant thing. God said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. And God gives the human race there its great mandates, its creation mandates. First of all, the mandate to reproduce. Be fruitful and increase in number. And today we hear that with a measure of ambivalence. Because we know that the Earth's population is expanding at such a phenomenal rate, and of course we should not reproduce beyond our own ability to provide and to care for. But at the same time, the fear that today prevents reproduction is itself an effect of unbelief. And it's as if God was saying to the race in this new environment, don't be afraid, be fruitful and increase in number. But he also said, fill the earth. That is not the same thing as be fruitful and increase in number. It is more this, don't stay where you are. The whole earth is yours. And they would say, but we don't know what's over the mountain, what's over the river. We don't know what dangers may lie. And he says, the whole earth is yours. And we know, of course, too, what a marvelous thing that is. That of all species, man has proved the most adaptable, able to live in the Arctic, at the equator, at sea level, at high altitude, in jungle and desert. Man able to fill the earth. And I think that there is something, again, terrific going on here. It is the mandate to live on the frontier, the mandate to cross the frontier. It is the mandate to colonize and to move ever forward and onwards and upwards into new spheres, geographically, intellectually, scientifically, theological. Don't be frightened to keep on moving. Live on the edge, fill the earth, and then the third thing, subdue it. So be fruitful, fill the whole earth, and subdue it. Now this is not a mandate, of course, for ecological exploitation, for polluting our rivers and overgrazing our hillsides and corrupting our skies. But we are to exercise rule, intelligent rule over it, that will ensure its perpetuation for generations that come after ourselves. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. Use the powers which follow from this fact that you are made in the image of God. Use those powers to rule benignly over the environment which God has placed you. And then again we have the phrase in verse 29, then God said, I give you every seed, and here is the mandate for man to use all those plants for food. And then verse 31, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. We've seen that phrase so often, that form of words. God saw, and it was very good. And here again, God sees. But this time, it's not good. It is very good. Or as it really says here, and it was really very good. God looks with his tremendous satisfaction on the work of his own hands, and he says, that's really good. That is, once the human race emerges, it's not only good, it's very good. It's really very good. Once this queen of creation emerges, it really is very good. But we've also got to remind ourselves that the great observer, the great moral judge, the great art critic is God himself. And how important his judgment is. There's been so much talk this week of the Turner Prize. I have to confess, I don't know who won the prize or what the prize was, but I guess that if the past is any guide, that it has gone to some absurdity. And you cannot help but think, does God think the Turner Prize is very good? Really very good. So let's remind ourselves that it is his judgment alone that matters in all our artistic enterprises. And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. And then the first 3 verses of chapter 2 belong in every way, in fact, to Genesis 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And then we come to the 7th day. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested, or he ceased from all his work. And God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from the work of creating that he had done. And in a way, that draws a line under creation. There'll be a great deal of development from this point onwards. There'll be earthquakes and volcanoes, and maybe there'll be comets and asteroids and drought and flood and famine and so on. There'll be many changes in man's environment after that, and there'll be development within God's own created species after that as well. And there'll be God's providential ordering, preserving, governing all things. But the work of creating, that's over. Everything is now in place for the story to follow. In the beginning there was God. Now there is God, plus the vegetation, plus the sea-born creatures, plus the land-born creatures, and there is man. And so the stage is set for God and man and the serpent and the garden. It's all here, the scene is set. And so on that 7th day, God ceased from his work. This creation week, the 6 great cycles, and then the 7th cycle, which probably is still continuing, of the divine Sabbath. And God blessed the 7th day. Now that's not the first reference to blessing. We saw that he blessed the animals, and he blessed man, and he blesses the seventh day. But what is a first is this: he made it holy, he hallowed it. And it is very interesting that the first thing that God hallowed, that God declared holy, was the seventh day. So he blessed it, and he made it holy, or hallowed it, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Well, I shall leave it there, and perhaps if you want to ask me some easy questions, that may be possible.